Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining the Veritas Forum and the Religion and Public Life program for tonight's conversation. My name is Eric Mingle, and I'm a campus pastor here with Chi Alpha Christian Fellowship. I'm also a fellow with the Veritas Forum. The Veritas Forum is an organization that seeks to help students and faculty alike ask and find answers to some of life's hardest questions. In fact, many of the world's leading universities were founded to answer the big why questions of life. So the goal of forums like this evening is to help confront those questions anew by committing to courageous conversations, placing the historic Christian faith in dialogue with other beliefs, and inviting participants from all backgrounds to pursue truth together. Our second sponsoring organization this evening is the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. The vision of this program is to do research on religion and to create common ground for the common good. They accomplish this vision through research, training, and outreach, and you can learn more about them by visiting their website at rplp.rice.edu, and you can even join their mailing list. Tonight I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing our speakers. We have Elaine Howard Ecklund, who is the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology here at Rice University. She's also the founding director of the Religion and Public Life program. Her research uses social scientific methods to explore the public relationship between science and religion. Elaine is the author of 5 books and over 60 research articles, her latest being Secularity in Science, what scientists around the world really think about religion. And this book will be released later this summer from the Oxford University Press. In addition, the Religion and Public Life program will be partnering with Rice's Baker Institute for Public Policy to host an official book release this fall. So mark your calendars for this event. It'll be September 24th, and if you're on the mailing list, you can stay tuned for more information. Our second presenter tonight is Denise Daniels, who is a professor of management and associate vice president for strategic initiatives at Seattle Pacific University. Her research interests include the meaning of work, Sabbath, leadership, and motivation. Denise regularly consults and provides executive coaching services in the area of leadership development, as well as training workshops on a variety of organizational topics, including motivation, decision-making, workforce retention, and management of diversity. We're calling tonight's conversation, Faith at Work, Does It Work? This topic was inspired by the research currently being conducted by Elaine and Denise, and in brief, their study includes focus groups, a national survey, and interviews of many people all around the topic of faith and work integration. Their goal in leading this large study is to inform the public about the opportunities and challenges associated with how individuals understand their faith to inform their work and what congregations and leaders might do to support the appropriation of faith among the laity, faith and work among the laity. Tonight, in a few moments, Elaine and Denise will be sharing some of their initial findings from their research. Following this presentation, I'll have some questions to bring out additional themes, as well as to learn more about their personal perspectives on such issues. Then there will be a time for some questions from the audience, so please be thinking of your questions, write them down, and at the appropriate time, I'll direct you and where and how you can ask them. Finally, I invite everyone to join us for some light refreshments in the courtyard after the program. Thank you for joining us tonight. Please help me welcome Elaine and Denise.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. And Eric, thank you for that warm introduction. That was really wonderful. Really appreciate that. I want to acknowledge a few people who helped prepare this presentation. Haley Hemstreet, Bob Thompson, and Deidre Coleman, so thank you, who are with the Religion and Public Life program. I also want you to know that you've been given a handout when you came in with some more information about our study and some ways to contact us if you are interested. I tell my students when they give presentations, never give disclaimers, and I'm going to just get right on with it and state what you're here to state, right? But I am going to say, not as a way of disclaimering, but as a way of helping you help us, that these are initial findings from our Faith at Work study. So if you listen attentively, you will actually have the chance to influence the future of the study. We still have some more data to collect, so what you say here is very, very important since we're in our initial stages. I hate to tell you this too. Social science is science, and my own field of sociology thinks of itself very much as using scientific methods to understand our social world, especially group behavior dynamics. So we have very much a research narrative for how this study started and how it builds on previous research. But there is also, when you study people, those of you who study people know, there are always personal stories that have an impact on our research as well. And when Denise and I met is when we started dreaming about this study. So our story of how this study began is one that's a little bit personal to us. We met actually at an HEB Family Foundation retreat at Laity Lodge, which some of you know of, and we were part of a convening about leadership and how to understand, use spiritual principles to better understand leadership. And as we went to these retreats together, we got talking to each other, and we realized that some of these spiritual struggles and trying to apply spiritual principles to leadership were struggles very much about our own lives. We had struggles of being in professions that we thought were very, very demanding. We were both raising children. We were both trying to mentor students and sort of caring for the next generation of people in our lives through our academic work. We were trying to do good research. We felt like we had all of these tensions and struggles going on. It was almost like friendship at first sight. We're like, oh my gosh, someone who understands me. Let's get to know each other. And then as academics do, this is the kind of thing academic friends do. We're like, oh, let's do research together. So, that's like, other people like don't bond that way, right? They're not like, oh, let's do a study together. Wouldn't that be so cool, right? But we also have differences, which is we're in different disciplines, we're in very different geographic areas of the country. Denise is in Seattle, and I'm in Houston. And all of this informs our research, and we're eager to talk about those personal dynamics later on as well. Okay, I'm going on faith here with these slides because they're behind me, so thankfully I did print out something. So we want to argue tonight that faith at work is relevant to the majority of Americans. For many, work is the single greatest time commitment in life. So I tell my students, you better like your work because you're going to be spending a lot of time at it. Some people are getting sad about that right now. I said maybe I shouldn't, to be very attentive when you're a teacher, right? You say things that emotionally damage the students. So according to our Faith at Work study, the average full-time worker spends approximately 58% of their waking hours at work during the week. And for many, faith is the most meaningful component of their life. This is the data that we came into the study with. According to a 2017 Pew Survey research study, 71% of Americans think of themselves as Christians, and 78% identify with some religious tradition. Americans, especially when compared to many other cultures, are also very likely to be involved in religious organizations rather than just to identify with a religious tradition. So we kind of put all of that on the table and dreamed about what it would be like to study faith at work in a way that other people had not. We started reading books about this, and we realized that many of the books about work, Studs Terkel's Working is a very famous volume about work life, do not include much about faith. A more recent book called Gig does not include much about faith. And we realized that books about faith, God at Work, our own Michael Lindsay's Faith in the Halls of Power, focus on a very narrow sector of the American population. So these kinds of studies tend to focus mainly on leaders, to be concerned about those who have responsibility for people in sort of upper echelons of society, mainly those who have high earning power in our society, mainly men. And these studies tend to be very limited in their racial diversity, in their treatment of different kinds of occupational categories, even different regions of the country. And so we wanted to get a much more diverse sense of what it might mean to experience faith at work, how people see these things as coming together or not coming together. And we also wanted to study experiences of religious discrimination in the workplace and how religious discrimination may or may not overlap with other kinds of discrimination. So to that end, we started by doing focus groups with Christian congregations and leaders. We started with Christians because they're a majority of the religious population. And we started here too because our funder, the Lilly Endowment, is primarily interested in understanding the dynamics of U.S. Christianity. I should say that we don't want to end here, that we're very interested in going on to studying more intensively other religious groups outside of the Christian community in the U.S. We did do to that end, we just finished it actually in the last couple of weeks, which is crazy risky that we're presenting this data to you. Don't tell anyone. It's also being taped, so. We're presenting this data in its very initial phases. So we just finished a survey of the general population in the U.S. of 13,000 people, which is a very large survey. And this will allow us to compare Christians to all Americans, both religious and non-religious. And we also were able to get oversamples, so to take more people into our survey in these population groups that are present in the general population, oversamples of Muslims and Jews. And we were also then in the process of doing follow-up interviews with at least 200 Christian congregants and pastors and other leaders. We completed 62 of those to date, so we still have more of those to do. We wanted to start by trying to understand how faith influences the ways that people approach their work. So we were interested in particular in this. The extent to which someone agrees or disagrees that their faith or spirituality influence the choice of their current job. So for this particular schematic, we have the all in green, so all respondents pooled, and we break it out according to those who identify as Christian, those who identify as Muslim, those who identify as Jewish. The men are in blue, following conventional stereotyping, and the women are in orange. We were going to go with pink, but I just could not pull that off. So we found that for Christians and Muslims, for about a third say that faith influenced their choice of job, but interestingly, the gender influence was different for different traditions, with a higher proportion of Christian women saying that faith influenced their choice of job, and for Muslims, a higher proportion of men said that faith influenced their jobs. Here's one response from a Christian interview respondent of someone whose faith motivated him to choose his career. He's someone who went into politics, where you may or may not think of this as having the potential to be motivated by faith, but for this respondent, am I supposed to get a laugh? No? Okay. So I did choose the area of politics to get into because part of my faith is to uplift people in need, to make sure that people who are struggling, that they get help. You'll see that we point out here the gender of the person as they identified, the racial group that the person identified with, their religious tradition, their career, and then there's a code, which is just for sorting purposes for us to document them in the interview. We also wanted to know whether people see their jobs as a spiritual calling, so something that they're doing as part of their faith life. Okay, so on this particular schematic, we see the percent who agree or strongly agree that they see their work as a spiritual calling. This is very interesting. I feel like I'm presenting numbers in church because of the way that we are in this particular sacred space. It's very interesting. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just unusual for me. So we see that a higher proportion of evangelical Protestants, when compared to mainline Protestants and Catholics, see their work as a spiritual calling, and a higher proportion of Muslims, when compared to mainline and Catholic Christians, see their work as a spiritual calling. So interestingly, the highest proportions here are the evangelical Protestants and the Muslims who see their work as a spiritual calling. So we found a range of perspectives about whether work is a spiritual calling. It varies by religious tradition. And here's one respondent who says this, a white woman who's an evangelical, who's a kindergarten teacher, said, 100%, this is my calling. I know beyond a shadow of doubt that this is what God called me to do. There are others who were not as convinced. Here is a respondent, is a white man who's Catholic, who's a facilities director, who says, no, paycheck and money influenced me to take this job. Another person, a woman, thank you. Another person who said, I don't really think my faith drives my work. Something that we're noticing in the data is that being able to choose a job born out of sense of calling may be a privilege of the economically privileged. That's something we're thinking about. Denise, I'll hand it over to you. You have to really click hard.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just
Thanks.
like mash down.
We'll do that. You guys can call me out if I'm not moving the slides
thank you
ahead
for
the way that I should.
I'll watch carefully and then
You
kick
can poke me, yeah.
Poke.
So-
No kicking, poking.
So Elaine has talked quite a bit about people's orientation to work. So thinking about the work that they choose, thinking about whether or not the job that they're going into is a calling or not. And what I want to talk about next, or what some of our research data looks at, is the extent to which people are integrating their faith at work. So what happens when they get on the job, and what are the ways that they engage with their faith at work? And we're using a framework here that was developed by David Miller from Princeton University. He actually wrote one of the books that Elaine showed you on a previous slide. And he comes up with a four-quadrant framework, and each of the quadrants begins with an E, which either is really helpful or really terrible for remembering these different ways of integrating faith at work. I'm not sure which. But he calls it the integration profile. And the first way of integrating faith is the extent to which somebody experiences meaning at work. And so this is derived from daily work tasks or what the organization itself is producing or doing. And so the extent to which somebody focuses on that as a way of integrating their faith and work is one of the ways that people do that. The second way that people do this integration is through what he called enrichment. And so enrichment would include things like private prayer, but it also could include things like a small group that you might engage with. And this prayer or small group experience is not just outside of work and independent from it, but it's something that actually cultivates or contributes to somebody's work life in some way. The third way that people engage with or integrate their faith is through expression of faith. And this might be communicating their faith commitments maybe verbally by telling other people what they believe, or it might be through posting something on the wall or through some piece of attire, but somehow communicating their beliefs to others through expression. And then the last way that people integrate is through an ethical commitment. And so this is for people who think about their faith as really important to how they make decisions at work, the extent to which they express integrity, the extent to which they're willing to speak up against injustice, for example. So I'm going to start with, we're going to go through and give examples of each of these four. We're going to show some of the data from each of those four categories, and then we're going to give some examples from people we've interviewed and how they talked about those four. The first thing that we're going to start with is that first way people integrate their faith and work, and that is through the experience of meaning and purpose. I do want to point out that these four ways are really initial ways that we're thinking about and conceptualizing this integration. This is just an idea, and so far our data seems to be supportive of this, but this may not be all of the ways that people go about integrating their faith and work, and hopefully our research may provide us with some additional insights, which we may or may not allocate with E-lettered items, but we'll see. So if you look at this graph, there's a lot of data here. So I want to start by calling your attention to the green lines. And we have lost some of our labels here, which I'm not sure what's happening, but I'm gonna talk you through this so that you can follow what I'm saying. The first two lines correspond to evangelical Protestant. The next line that's not labeled is mainline Protestant. The middle line is Catholic. The next line that's not labeled is Muslim. Then there's Jew, and then this last category is no religion, so people who did not identify as having any religious tradition. So if you can keep those in mind, evangelical, mainline Catholic, the first three are Christian, Muslim, Jew, and no religion. Okay, so having gotten that, now focus on the green lines. The green lines correspond to a question that we asked of our survey respondents, and we asked, to what extent does your faith help you experience meaning and purpose in your daily tasks? And so again, you can see that there's quite a bit of variance across these green lines. The highest is the evangelical Christians. Those folks have 85% of them say, yes, my daily tasks provide me with meaning. The very low end there is the no religion group, and 19% of those folks say that their daily tasks provide them with meaning in some way. So huge variance across different religious traditions in terms of their sense of meaning and purpose. The blue line is a more collective approach to this. So the blue line doesn't ask about your personal daily tasks. The blue line is a question associated with the end product of the workplace. So in an organizational setting, what my organization does is meaningful. And so when we ask people this question, there's much less variance across different religious groups, and you see the blue lines being much more comparable. But we still see the highest score associated with evangelical Christians, the lowest score here associated with those with no religion. Okay? So we're going to give you a couple of examples of people who talked about this. The first one, this particular example is from a white woman who is an engineer, and I actually interviewed her, and it was really interesting because she started talking about how when she started working, she really thought that she was going to serve poor people. So the default position was meaning would come out of serving poor people. And then she got into this job working for a city and realized all of a sudden that she wasn't really serving poor people, and she was really struggling with how to connect this and how to make sense of this and how to understand this as meaningful. So here's what she says. I kind of figured I would get this heroic job and serve God every day with my job and help poor people. And then when I had to kind of put that to sleep for a while, I realized that my job doesn't have to be, she pauses a really long time. 4 seconds in an interview is really long. My job doesn't have to be something that's labeled as Christian or something that's directly serving the poor in order for it to be meaningful. And so she's coming to this realization that her job is meaningful, but it's not because of explicitly the things that she'd thought about coming into work that she thought would make it meaningful. All right, the second category, the second way that people engage and integrate their, I shouldn't say engage because that's one of the E words, so I'm going to use the word integrate here. Second way that people integrate their faith with their work is through what we're calling, and what David Miller called, enrichment. And so these are things like prayer, small group experiences, ways that they're enriching their work life through what they're engaging in, wrong word, through what they're doing to integrate their faith. And again, you'll see a green line and a blue line. The green line is, again, more individualistic. These are people who are responding and talking about the benefits that they get from praying, the benefits that they get from praying at work. And again, we see quite a bit of variance across the groups here. We've got, good, the labels do exist on this one, that's nice. Evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant Catholic, and then Muslim and Jew. And we see again the evangelical Protestants having the highest score here. They're the most likely to say, yes, prayer enriches my job. The lowest scores here are associated with our Jewish respondents. The blue line here is connected with people participating in some kind of group that encourages their spirituality and influences the way that they engage with their work. And here the range again is quite large. 62% of our evangelical respondents say that this is true. They agree with this statement, either agree or strongly agree that they're involved in a group that helps them to engage, or that enriches their faith in some way at work. So I want to give you a couple of examples of people who are talking about this. This first one is from a black woman who comes from a charismatic Christian tradition. When we talked to her, she was the executive director of a nonprofit, but she had previously been a nurse. And so what she's talking about here is from her nursing career. She says, when you're doing heart surgery and somebody's bleeding out on the table, you have a different perspective than if you worked at an insurance company and you're looking at codes. When I have the person bleeding out on the table in the operating room, yeah, I'm praying. I'm praying as I'm loading the sutures and getting the platelets ready, assisting somebody, or making certain that the scrub. I'm having a hard time with reading here right now because my font size is small and it's dark up here. You might be able to read it better. Let's see. Making certain that the scrub nurses have what they need. I'm praying. I'm absolutely praying for guidance for this person and for the family, and I'm doing it as I work. I pray for guidance. I pray for clarity. I pray that I'll be able to make the correct decisions, and I'll make the decisions based on what's best and try to keep my ego out of it, but try to be thinking in the best possible way, and I'm healing. So she really is connecting her work of praying with that task of healing that she's engaging with at work. Here's another example. This woman, also a white woman, is Catholic, and she works as a waitress. And this is actually a woman that we didn't interview after the surveys, which we had most of the people were interviewed in that way, but she was part of the focus groups that we did in our first phase of this study. But she says, I start off the morning with a prayer and just saying to myself, this is going to be a great day. Starting off that way in the morning gives me a sense of positive vibe. So she's getting ready to go wait tables, and prayer is part of her way of enriching that job and engaging her faith to make that job more significant. The third example is an example of somebody who talks about a spiritual group at work. This is a black woman. She's an evangelical, and she works as a corporate trainer. And she says, we have one guy at her work who works in our building, and he's a strong believer. He organizes, I think every Tuesday morning, they have a prayer meeting. He doesn't go around talking about it. You kind of just have to hear about it on the, word of mouth. And they'll get together and pray for our company. And then if you ask him, he'll add you to the distribution list. And he sent out a daily devotional every day via email. I think that that's wonderful. So she's talking about this group as a way of enriching her life and her work through her faith. All right, the third way that people integrate their faith with their work is through their expression of faith and work. And so this is communicating their faith commitments either verbally or non-verbally. Good, again, we have labels. Glad to see that. So once again, if you start with the green line here is people expressing their faith verbally. So these are people who agree with the statement, I feel motivated to talk about my faith or my spirituality with people at work. The standout line here is the very first one, which is the evangelical Christians. 56% of our evangelical respondents said, yes, that's true. They feel motivated to talk about their faith in the context of work. Nobody else in any other faith tradition has the same strong response. The blue line here is talking about wearing or displaying items that represent one's faith or spirituality. And here the lines are all lower, but you get quite a bit of variance here in the 20 to 30% range. So some people are doing this. It's not the majority, but a few people are. One thing that is notable on this one, do I have a, well, I can't make a, nope, I don't have a red little dot. One thing that's notable here is the Muslim respondents. We did not break it out, but if you did break out the Muslim respondents in terms of men and women, and you look at that blue line, you would see that female Muslims, their response rate here is at 40%. So they're much more likely to say that they're wearing or displaying something that indicates their faith, which makes some sense if you think about it, because many practicing Muslims will wear some type of hijab or some other indicator of their faith. And Muslim men are significantly lower on that particular point. So this one has a gender distinction. So let me give you some examples of our Christian respondents who talked about how they expressed their faith at work. This particular person is a logger, a white man, an evangelical, and he talks about logging and kind of in a nuanced way. He says there's a lot of controversy about logging. Part of that controversy comes up if you get into the global warming controversy. My belief on nature is that it is put in place by God, and I think we have a responsibility to do very good work for the purpose of following the command of dressing and keeping it. But I also believe it's fairly arrogant to think that we're going to destroy it completely and easily. In other words, God still is in control. Therefore, as we're talking to foresters, as we're talking to landowners, I end up sharing my belief and why I believe what I believe. And then in that way, opening the subject to be able to witness to them. So he's talking very explicitly about expressing his faith through the work that he does with the ultimate goal of evangelizing and talking to others about his faith. There are several other people that we talked to that were much more reticent to talk about their faith. And so we have an example of somebody whose expression of faith at work is quite limited. This person is a white woman, an evangelical Spanish teacher, and she says, well, you can't talk about it in public school. You can't talk about your faith. You cannot talk, and I'm very respectful of that. Or if somebody asks me directly, like a student sometimes will ask me, do you believe in God? I'd really rather not talk about that in my class. But if you'd like to stay after class or stay after school, I'll be happy to talk to you about it. But I usually don't bring it up to my students. And when they bring it up to me, I want to respect other people's religions and backgrounds. So this expression of faith at work is there, but it's in a very limited way. She recognizes some boundaries around it. And then we also had some respondents who really had no expression of faith. They were very careful not to express their faith at work. This was a Catholic Latinx man, and this was in response to a question from the interviewer, to what extent is there religious diversity in your workplace? And he says, I would imagine so, just based by the ethnic makeup, but something you don't discuss while at work for professional reasons, something that would get you definitely in trouble if discussed. You don't go around, and it's something you don't openly put out there. So very clear that that's not something that's talked about in his workplace. So the final way that people think about and integrate their faith at work, that, again, these preliminary ways, is through ethical commitments. And here there is the sense of personal integrity, but also there's a sense of, am I willing to speak up in an organizational context against things that maybe I feel uncomfortable with? With that personal integrity, that's the green line across the board here. And again, we've lost our labels: evangelical, mainline, Catholic, Muslim, Jew, and the last category here is no religion. With the entire group, we only see a 2 percentage point difference on this question. Basically, 97% of the respondents say, yeah, my personal integrity I am engaging with in my workplace. So there's really very little difference across respondents on this. But when you ask them, to what extent do you express your view when observing practices that conflict with your faith or your spirituality, here you start to see more variance. The numbers across the board are lower, but you see more differentiation across groups. So for our evangelical Christians, 73% of them say, yeah, I raise issues when I feel like there's something systemic going on, down to the no religion category, which has only 55% of the respondents saying, yes, I'm willing, or I agree that I will speak up in those kinds of circumstances. So I want to give you an example of somebody who is engaging with their faith and talking about their personal integrity in this sense. This particular person is somebody who's a criminal investigator, and you're not going to see this come up in the quote, but the entire interview with this person, they were really talking about the importance of their faith and how their faith drives their personal integrity. And what you'll see from the quote is an example of how that happens. So he says, as a criminal investigator, there's things that involve pornography that is required for me to be involved with that is uncomfortable. So the interviewer says, well, how do you manage those situations when you have to look at something that wouldn't be what you would choose? And he responds, first of all, with a big sigh. So the first thing I do is I try to check myself. And here he laughs. He says, I make sure that I'm not just using this as a cover to indulge in something that I really want to do. So there's a lot of introspection that goes on ahead of time. And then I need to do this because this is somebody's daughter that's been exploited. And I need to help them in whatever way I can, even if it means viewing something that I don't ordinarily view. And so he's contextualizing this in the context of his faith and saying, this is something I need to do for my job, but there's also a way for me to think about it that puts a positive perspective on this behavior that I think is problematic. The second example I want to give of ethical commitments is somebody who engages in their faith in a much more structural way. So instead of just it being a personal integrity issue, this is a person who makes an effort to change the system. And so notice this about her. This is a white woman, an engineer. She says, one time, we really needed to do this analysis. We needed some software to do it. We found the software online that could do it for us. But I found a note saying that it shouldn't be used for commercial purposes. So, yeah, I kind of mentioned that to my boss, and he was like, oh, it's fine, just use it. And I was like, I don't really think that's okay. And then she laughs. I just told him no. And I told him that I would work it out with the IT person to find another way to do it. So she's responding to him personally, but then she's also saying structurally, we're going to figure out another way that doesn't hurt the organization, that allows us to do something with and allows me to retain that integrity at the same time. So we're going to shift a little bit here, and we're going to next talk about discrimination, and Elaine is going to present some other data to you around that topic.
So another one of the big topics of this study is trying to understand religious discrimination and how groups in particular, comparing the Christian groups to Muslims and Jews, see religious discrimination and the extent to which they perceive themselves as being discriminated against, and then to understand how religious discrimination overlaps with or helps one cope with, or how one's religiosity helps one cope with discrimination. So we're also interested in particular in race-based discrimination and in gender-based discrimination. So first, we're going to give a little bit of data about that. So this is just the percent who reported ever having been treated unfairly in the context of work because of their religion or non-religion. And this is comparing, again, we have the evangelical Protestants on the left, mainline Protestants next, Catholics, and then Muslims, and then Jews. And you'll see that Muslims have by far the largest percent who report having ever been treated unfairly in the context of work because of their religion. So quite a striking proportion there, 62%. Jews have the next largest at 53%, evangelical Protestants next at 36%, and then mainline Protestants, and then Catholics. So to give you a little bit of sense of what this might mean, and remember that we did interviews in this phase of the study only with Christian respondents, so we don't unfortunately have interviews with Muslims and Jews, although we're pursuing the possibility of doing those as well. So this next quote is from an evangelical Protestant who's white, who says this: "I was promoted to sergeant, that's all the highest I ever got. All of my immediate supervisors wanted to promote me to lieutenant. But we worked for a big facility. They had a bunch of people who ran that facility, wardens and deputy wardens and administrators and stuff like that, who, I heard it from different people that talked about, well, I don't know if we want that religious guy up in there." So this interview was really interesting to me because he talked quite a bit about how he openly shared his faith in the workplace, and he got these kind of subtle messages that that probably wasn't okay, that they wouldn't really want someone who was so open about their faith in leadership. And he perceived that very much as being the subject of discrimination, of being as a result of discrimination that he wasn't promoted more. Another thing that we're thinking about as we continue to collect these data and analyze them is to what extent perceptions of discrimination are very occupation specific and might take different forms in different occupations, or if discrimination might be more present or absent in specific occupations. This is a quote or a set of statements from a man who considers himself an evangelical Christian, who's a graphic artist, who says this. Who says, "I know some people who work for entertainment companies who are religious, and they've been kind of blacklisted over the years. And it's because more of a problem as time has gone on from the 90s to now, because it's entertainment, because it deals with the arts, which have always been kind of, I don't want to say liberal, but more liberal, progressive. It's become less friendly to people of religious faith, traditional beliefs, and people who have made their beliefs known regarding their religion. I've been sort of systematically pushed out or made to feel not welcome. I realized 15 years ago, just seeing how people I knew were being treated, that it would not be friendly to me." We also wanted to look at how religious people see racial discrimination, and we'll be continuing to do analyses with these data to try to understand the overlap or not between race and religion, because that's something that we're very interested in uncovering more deeply. So this next graphic looks in particular at the percent who've reported ever having been treated unfairly in the context of work because of race or ethnicity, and you'll see that we break out actually according to different ethnic groups of Christians. So first we have all Christians, and then we have evangelical Christians, and then we have white Christians, and then black Christians is the largest bar there. Then those who identify as Hispanic, and then Muslims, and then Jews. So by far, these are the religious groups that report racial discrimination, which is an interesting way to think about the overlap between race and religion, one way of analyzing that. And you see that by far, again, imagine the labels, that Muslims and that black Christians and Muslims, so the high bar on the left, that 78% on your left is black Christians, and the high bar to your right, which is 75%, is Muslims. So black Christians and Muslims are the two religious groups who say that they have ever been treated unfairly because of their race. Another thing we're exploring in this study is how faith might be used as a kind of resource to help one cope with, challenge, understand racial discrimination, and perhaps gender discrimination as well. So here's a quote which is primarily about race and faith, but also I think gender works in there as well. So this is from a black woman who sees herself as a liberal Christian who works as a financial analyst. And she says, just in dealing with upper managers who are generally men, not being listened to, or not being listened to, or business, you're a woman, and so you know if you're going to prove something, I'm coming in with 5 ways to prove one point as somebody else who would come in and just say it. I'm coming in with, and here's the proof, and here's the proof, and here's the proof, and still might not be believed. So you know, we always go back and forth between, is this a race thing? Is this a gender thing? Is it both? You never know. So the interviewer says, do you think your faith helps you deal with this kind of situations? And she says, yeah, that and the Xanax. Yes, just knowing. Did you do this one? Yeah. I think I read it and you asked her, like, do you really use Xanax? Yeah. It's very interesting. This too shall pass. You know, just kind of keeping that attitude, and people at my church always say, you know, no matter what, at the end of the day, God is in control. That's kind of what, you know, when it gets real crazy and you're kind of maybe lose your direction or something, then it's like at the end of the day, God is in control. So you're going to be okay. And that's kind of how she's talking about her faith. That's kind of how it helps. We also are looking at gender discrimination and perceptions of gender discrimination. So the men are green and the women are blue. So men green, women blue, just to try to defy gender stereotypes in this particular schematic. So this is the percent who report ever having been treated unfairly in the context of work because of their sex or gender. And here you'll see that evangelical Protestant women, 53% of them report this. Mainline Protestant women, 68%. Catholic women, 56%. Muslim women, 76%. So 76% of Muslim women say that they've been treated unfairly in the context of their work because of their gender. So interesting religion and gender overlap there. Jewish women, also very high, 76% also, 83% for those who are not religious. So the not religious there, women are reporting the greatest proportion who say that they've been treated unfairly because of their sex or gender. Evangelical women seem to have the lowest proportion who report being treated unfairly because of their sex or gender. But here is a quote from one who did feel that way, who says this: sometimes I wonder if I get the same evaluation scores that my male compatriots do. I find it fascinating that I've been there the longest of anyone in my department, and yet everyone is within 50 cents of making the same amount, the amount of money as I do, which I find interesting. They must have gotten better evaluations. Even though I've actually always gotten very good evaluations. I never had any negative evaluations, yet I feel that they've gotten better increases. So I'm going to end there and want to say again that this is the beginning of findings from this study. I hope that this has whet your appetite for more. The Religion and Public Life program will continue in partnership with Seattle Pacific University to be releasing findings from this study, holding events, writing books, writing many, many articles from these data. I also hope that you will raise some questions for us in the question and answer that it might actually help spur us on to collecting more and better data. So at this point, Eric has prepared some questions that he's going to ask us. While he's asking us those questions, you be thinking of your questions that you might have for us. And then we'll have snacks, right? Yeah, okay, all right, yeah.
Well, thank you both for your presentation. It was most intriguing and relevant to, I think, most of us here in this audience, so we really do appreciate it. At this time, I've just got a few questions, and as she mentioned, after this, we're going to enter into that Q&A, and before I get the last question of this portion, I'll let you know. That way, you can quickly scribble down that question you're going to ask. So, with no further ado, the first question I'd like to ask you is, can you tell us more about the origins of your research? Why did you choose this study, and maybe more interesting, why now?
You can.
So, Elaine talked a little bit at the beginning of the talk about what engaged us, and it was just really, at many levels, a very personal thing. We both were working, we both were people of faith who were thinking about our own faith in the context of the work that we were doing and wondering, what does that look like for other people? Are there things that we can learn from others that might be useful and relevant to us? So that was a piece of it, and the why now, there's several answers to that, actually. Part of it is that this was when we got to know each other and we wanted to pursue some research together. And part of it really is a function of something that we see happening sort of broadly across the United States and perhaps around the world as well. But an interest in people engaging their faith in the context of their work. So it's really consistent, I think, with much of the work that RPLP is doing broadly, but also what we're seeing outside of academic institutions, outside of centers, and people really thinking about what does it mean to be a person of faith, what does it mean for what I'm doing in my daily life, and particularly with my work.
And I've spent the past about 15 years actually now, I can't believe it's been that long, studying what scientists think about religion as one of the things that I've been studying in my research. So I know a whole lot about scientists. And I think when I started talking to Denise, I started wondering, are scientists distinctive? Well, we all know that they are, but, are sort of just in particular in the way that they think about faith and work and the way they respond to religion in the workplace. And is this, now I'm saying this kind of geeky research reasons for doing something that's hopefully as interesting to some of you, but is there a sense in which this occupational category of science is a very different kind of occupational category than, say, logging or other, I wasn't specifically thinking about logging, but I was thinking about other kinds of occupations that people might inhabit and wanting to know if this is very specific. Scientists also are in the high SES, the high socioeconomic strata of our society, and I was really starting to wonder, what about other kinds of jobs, especially outside of what we think of as traditionally white-collar jobs? What about blue-collar jobs? And as a sociologist, I'm always wondering about group cultures and how group cultures then have an impact on how people think about the freedom to talk about their faith or not, and those kinds of dynamics. So I think that's kind of interest. There is also, I think you've shared some of this work with me, a kind of move afoot in many corporate entities to start thinking about issues of integration of life spheres. So a lot of discussion about integrating family life and providing daycare on site and sort of thinking about these kinds of things. And so is faith another one of those spheres where corporations are finding that if people live as whole people, that they're also more productive workers?
Yeah, and interestingly, quite a few larger organizations, kind of cutting-edge organizations in many ways, are either starting or allowing and supporting employee interest groups that are affiliated by various faith traditions. And also some of them are bringing in workplace chaplains who can help employees kind of walk through life issues in the workplace. And so this recognition of people as whole beings.
Now we should look a little bit askance at that, right? I mean, I'm now making some normative claims that are beyond the scope of what we presented here, but when you start bringing all of your life to the workplace, do you start spending all of your life at the workplace? Do you really want to have your children cared for at work, to eat all your meals at work, and to have your church at work too? So let's sort of be suspicious of that, right? Right?
Yeah, and that's one of the criticisms of those approaches, and they tend to be undertaken by organizations that do tend to be whole life sucking.
Total whole life sucking
Exactly.
organizations.
That's the professional term.
Yeah. That feels like a T-shirt, and a whole life sucking organization. Are we going on too long for? This is question number one.
This is question number one of a dozen. No.
We can cut
Maybe
ourselves off.
less back and forth, right? I was sorry.
No, it's quite all right. Thank you so much for that. Well, Elaine, you're here at Rise, which is a secular institution, and Denise, SBU is a faith-based institution. So how do you each personally view faith work integration, and how are your views formed by your respective institutions?
For me, this is an interesting question. Seattle Pacific, where I have been a faculty member for 23 years, is a Christian university, and so there's an expectation at some level that faculty and staff will be Christian and will bring their faith experiences to the workplace in ways that I don't think happens at Rice. Because of that, I'm really encouraged to do research and teaching that has a faith orientation to it. And so there's really not any criticism or pushback. In fact, it's a strongly encouraged path for me to pursue in terms of this type of research. From a guild perspective, so when I think about it, when I go to academic conferences and present this kind of data, I don't want my own personal convictions to color people's perceptions of whether or not I'm an academic scholar who's doing good work. And so I want to be really careful to separate my own convictions from the actual research that's being done. In other words, I don't want to come to the table having certain preconceived notions about how people should be responding, and therefore that's what I find. I really want the data to speak for itself. And so I need to be personally careful in some ways about trying to make clear some of those boundaries. But generally speaking, I would say my institution is very supportive of this type of research and of the fact that I'm doing it in ways that I think, again, is going to be quite different for Elaine in a secular context.
Mm-hmm. Not everyone may agree with me, but I think Rice University, especially when compared to many other universities, is incredibly friendly to discussions about religion. It's funny, through my research, I work a lot with religious leaders, particularly pastors, and some of them who know that I'm also a church-going person will say, like, oh my gosh, how can you work at Rice University? It's so secular. And I'm like, have you been to other universities, like in the Ivy League? I mean, not to put any, I hesitate to mention any names of specific universities, so I'm going to not do that. But I mean, there's so many Christian students here and so many students of other traditions. There's so many Muslim students. I had occasion to survey the student body a few years ago, and about 40% of the Rice University campus thinks of themselves as committed Christians. About 15 or 20%, depending on who you define it, are members of other religious traditions, which is a huge proportion of people compared to the general population at large. So we have very committed Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and other religious traditions on campus. And so there is actually, I think of Rice as a religiously pluralistic. We have Sikhs on campus. We have, members of Baha'i faith on campus. So I was like shocked, actually, I even felt like I knew this because I teach courses on religion here. And of course, students are often drawn to my classes who come from different religious faiths. But I was really shocked and kind of heartened by the religious diversity of the campus. It's not all rosy. I mean, there is a sense where you have to be thoughtful, especially when you're a scholar of religion, about how you present religion in a way that is accessible to everyone. And that I spend a lot of time, that keeps me up at night. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about what that means to do research on religion in a way that's honoring of people's very heartfelt traditions. And it's a very complex kind of matter.
I would say, too, that Elaine and I have almost these inverse settings where she's in a secular institution in the context of a fairly religiously engaged population, and I'm in a religious institution in the context of the Northwest, which is very unengaged religiously, so very, very low church attendance or any kind of religious engagement. So in the cultural context of Seattle, being a person of faith is actually an outlier. I think in the cultural context of Houston, it's much less so.
Yeah. I mean, like, no one is like, oh my gosh, you study religion, why? Right? I mean, so that's dumb. I thought it ended. I mean, I've given talks where,
Seattle.
like, no, we're now dissing whole cities. I feel like we should not do that. There. Okay.
No, this is great. This is wonderful. Okay, so this question is sort of a two-part question for you, but from your data, around 1/3 or less of Christians, Muslims, and Jews said their faith was influencing their choice of jobs or career. Does the narrative data suggest, if not faith, what is informing their choice of jobs or careers? And then part two, was there any sense that their faith should or shouldn't be influencing their choice of jobs or careers?
I would say we don't have enough qualitative data yet to answer that question. However, we do have enough quantitative data that we probably could answer the first part of it, at least somewhat. What we suspect is that people, besides faith, people pursue jobs because they make money. And so, one of the quotes that Elaine talked about was somebody who said, no, it's not about the calling, it's about the money. And I think particularly with people from lower SES, lower socioeconomic status strata, their faith is not the driver because in some sense they can't afford it to be. And so we were talking about this a little bit last night, that really it is a privilege of the privileged to have a sense of calling, to have a sense that you can be choosing a job because you feel like God is calling you to it. And for many people, that's just not an option. They just need to put food on the table. And so I think that may be something that we'll be able to get at when we look at things like socioeconomic status in the context of our data. We just haven't done that analysis yet. We have the data. We just need somebody to run that data for us.
And I guess if there were an ought that I would say, so I think social science data is the best tool for description, and it's not a disciplinary tool for ought. Does that make sense? So its best way to use social science data is to get a very good descriptive lay of the land. If I were to make a claim, very much born out of my own faith, it's a gift to be able to choose your work out of a sense of calling, and so perhaps it ought to be used wisely, right? So that's something to just think about. At an elite university, we have the possibility of choice. So what does that mean? What is that as a responsibility? Yeah.
That's great. I've got one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Pertaining to the integration of faith and work in terms of calling, the data suggested that few people see their work as a spiritual calling. Mm-hmm. Does the narrative data suggest why or why not?
There was a range here of respondents, and so about a third of people said yes, a third of Christians, I should say, said yes, that is a spiritual calling. And then there were other people who said things like, I don't feel like it's a spiritual calling, but it's a way for me to engage in good things. And so they saw it as sort of a means to an end as opposed to an end in and of itself. And then there were some people who simply said, no, I haven't thought about it that way. And so whether that's a function of them not really having had the opportunity to engage that concept, whether it's a function of them not seeing a direct path for their job to be something that they feel like is really meaningful, or whether there's something else, we're not entirely sure, but I think there is more to do to try to examine that question.
And you do get the sense that the notion of calling is a very Protestant notion, and that our Catholic respondents already were noticing that that word calling does not resonate with them as much.
Well, it means something very specific.
Something very specific.
And it's not the workplace.
You're called, if you're a man, to the priesthood, or if you're a woman, to be a part of be a woman religious and be part of religious order. So there's this idea of people in the pews being called. And then something else that we're not able to access with narrative data, but just with the survey data, is if you are part of certain religious traditions that mean you need to wear very public religious symbols, you are drawn into a kind of performance of your religion in ways that other people are not, right? So if you're a Muslim woman and you cover, that is an out there symbol where you have to have a narrative for why you're doing religion at work, right? And so then something can turn post hoc into a calling, as a way of justifying your presence as a religious person in a particular discipline, or say if you're a Sikh man. So I think just thinking about these dynamics and how they differ across religious traditions is something that's also fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you both. At this time, I'd like to open it up to the audience. The way this is going to work is if you just raise your hand, Michael, over here on the side of the room, is going to walk over and give you the microphone. It's important that you remember that there's a Q&A, which means you're going to ask a question, and Elaine and Denise are going to give an answer. And so if you don't mind, just make sure to keep your questions brief so there's enough time for more people to get their questions in, and to make sure that they remain questions. That would be greatly appreciated. So at this time, if anyone would like to go first, Michael.
Great.
Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just want to say I appreciate that last question, and very curious to know if there is trending data, particularly about the spirituality of work, if people are recognizing that their work is intrinsically spiritual. That is to say, not just more people who are praying at work, but is there trending data of people who are recognizing their work as spiritual? And I think you've already answered that, but I'd really urge you to see if we can have more information. That's something that I think I'm very interested in. The question that I do have is, have you heard about this new thing called workism? This was talked about, I think, in the Atlantic. And is that finding its way into any of your research at all?
Yeah, so workism, meaning people putting work at the center of everything in their lives, right?
Almost that it's a religious orientation,
Yeah.
that the work itself fills the purpose that a church might previously have.
Yeah. So what is evidence from our data as to whether or not that's the case? One thing that we were just looking at yesterday is the number of hours that people work on average. And on average, so which means that many people are working more, right? On our data so far of full-time workers, it's getting up to near 50 hours on average. So that's a lot of time. I just think that's interesting to think about that level of time. And then if you are a person who has other kinds of life pursuits of varied orders, it may be hobbies, it may be taking care of aging parents, it may be taking care of children, it may be being part of a religious community, how would you then fit in all of your other life pursuits to have a full tapestry of life in the midst of that time? So if we just think about it as ordered blocks of time and how we think about that, that's very interesting. To the question of trending data, this is not a study over time, but we are replicating some survey questions that have been asked in other studies, which would allow us some sort of point-to-point comparison, of course, with different populations of people. That's kind of one social science response to that. And then another kind of thing is, what does it mean, and this would be more your area, so we should be in partnership, is what does it mean to have spiritual and moral reflection on work and how much one should be working and the way in which one should be working. So we can give you how much people are working and what they see as the meaning of their work and the different types of work. And then we see faith leaders as giving back to us moral and spiritual reflection on whether that should be the case, right? Or what should be different. I just think that's an interesting partnership there.
Good evening. This is really interesting. As I
Thank
listened
you.
to you, there was something that you did early on about the nurse and praying right away. You made a reference to an insurance coder. But in reality, the insurance coder can have a huge impact
Yes.
on somebody's quality of life.
Absolutely.
And how much do people think about that?
It was hard for them to imagine it. It's funny, like actually we've kind of talked about this offline a little bit, that I think we thought, especially this was our stereotyping going into the study, but we thought especially for highly educated people, who have a lot of agency in the kind of jobs that they choose, they might have thought about, if they're also religious, how the nature of their work might be in and of itself a kind of faith pursuit. And they seem to have narrow scripts, meaning they have a narrow range of ideas of things that count as spiritual. So it came out in these quotes, like, okay, if you're helping poor people, that counts. If you're saving someone's life, that counts. Coding something on insurance, that doesn't count. In general, sort of things that touch money, things like there are certain things that are sacred and certain things that seem to be at the very least not sacred, even verging over into not good.
And I would say, generally speaking, that line there is the extent to which you're interpersonally engaging with somebody else. And so to the extent that you're doing that, people can see those connections more clearly. To the extent that you're not doing that, people don't see those connections as clearly. So that's not to say that they don't exist, and some people are very thoughtful about how they're thinking about that. And in fact, that woman engineer that I quoted, who said, I'm not serving poor people. In fact, what she was doing was civil engineering, and she was creating, sewage pipes. But then she's like, that actually is super important. I'm like, yes, it is super important. But it took a while for her to come to that, and I think most of our respondents really don't have that level of nuance in their responses. And so we're just reporting what people are saying. Our job is not necessarily to say what they should or shouldn't think. It's simply to try to find out what's the universe of what exists. And then I think it's up to others to start to take that information and think about, well, how can we help people maybe to think more intentionally about what they're doing and the value of what they're doing and how it can contribute to society more broadly when it's not touching another person directly.
And I think we've also been surprised at the extent to which people see their agency through faith at work as being very much about individual actions and not very much about changing structures or fighting for a more just world. I mean, when we think about like things, occupations that work with money, well, economic inequality is one of the main forms of inequality in our world. So if part of your job is to create a more just economic structure through the nature of, or contribute to that through the nature of the kinds of decisions you make, even if you don't have very much one-to-one contact with people during the day, that could be, according to some frameworks, an incredibly spiritual pursuit. And so that's sort of thinking about the range of ways is really interesting in this study. I think there's been some surprises already.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you saw that really clearly, if you recall the ethical commitment slide that I had, where 95 to 97% of people said, yes, I act with integrity at work, but many fewer said, I speak up when the structure is problematic. I speak up when there's something going on in the organization. Those numbers were much, much lower, where only about 2/3 of people were reliably saying something along those lines. So it does seem to be that it's easy for us to see the individual. It's easy for us to see what our responsibility is. It's much more difficult for us to see what our responsibility is in a structure and in a system and how we can change those things, even though we know from sociological data and all social sciences that the structures themselves are much more powerful in affecting people's outcomes than the individual behaviors are.
I am a teacher at one of the Catholic high schools in town here, and I teach a class on business and faith. And so the comment that I have and question that I have is in relationship to this last topic that we just talked about. In this class I teach, we have a topic or a concept in our tradition called the common good, and that's the way that we get at these ideas of like structure. And I'm curious, because I don't know other traditions well enough, whether other traditions also have some notion of the common good with which to try to understand faith commitment in more than just like an interactional sense. Do you know about that?
I would say that Protestants are adopting that language, and so there is a shift towards common good language in Protestant contexts, but I would also say that it's a relatively new shift. So I think historically, it has been a much more individualized faith and this, these personal conversion stories and so on. And so it's much less systemic in its approach, but I do think that is shifting. I don't know enough about other religious traditions to speak to it. Can you speak to others?
Yes, so in this phase of the study, we've done interviews only with Christians, so what's coming out in our interviews is language of Catholics and Protestants using a narrative of the common good. I know from other work I have done that kind of language is very prevalent in Judaism and Islam as well. I wouldn't say that it's not present in other traditions, but these are traditions that I've studied fairly thoroughly for other studies. Yeah.
One of the most striking disparities I saw was the very last slide, which, as I recall, 83% of the women who did not identify with religion perceived discrimination. 83%. The next closest group was evangelical women at 53%. So based on your narrative research, or I would invite you to speculate, how do you make sense of that very high percentage?
Let me first of all make a clarification on point. You're right, 83% of people of no faith, the women in those groups, identified having experienced gender discrimination. The 56% of evangelical Christians was the lowest. So that was the range, and everyone else was somewhere in between. And we've talked actually quite a bit about this, and the answer is we don't know. We have some conjectures, but they are total conjectures at this point. I could tell you my conjectures, but they're really probably not any more worth than anybody else's conjectures. So,
I mean, we do want the question, it begs the question, are other women experiencing this and they're not naming it? or they maybe not, they don't have, I mean, one kind of hypothesis would be that they don't have a language to talk about discrimination in the same way that non-religious. It could be that their religious tradition is suppressing conversation about gender discrimination. We don't know. Those are kind of things that I would say, let's hypothesize this and see if this comes up, if there's any evidence for it in the interview data.
But this is something that we're also very interested in, and we really would like to find some answers to. So it's a great question. We just don't know the answer.
I was wondering about the influence of age, and if there are any generational changes that you've seen as you've looked at the data, maybe within a certain religious group, or looking at the data set as a whole and the way they conceptualize faith and work.
I don't have the data in front of me, but yes, we have looked at some of it by generational cohort. And so we've looked at basically the silent generation, the boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Generation Z. And what we do see that's really notable across generations is an overall decline in religiosity, period. And so older people, older generations, are much more likely to have a faith affiliation than younger people. Our older cohort also tends to be much more homogenous in terms of their faith tradition, and so it tends to be much more Christian, whereas our youngest cohort tends to be much more heterogeneous, much more diverse with respect to the religious traditions that are represented, which makes sense.
And there's almost like it's funny, and our data maps onto some other data in terms of religious cohort shifts in religion, in that evangelicals are staying fairly consistent. The mainline Protestants are radically decreasing across society, which makes overall religiosity go lower, right? But it's worth noting which groups are staying high and which groups are, I mean, that's will be borne out in this data in interesting ways. And then asking, well, what impact does that have on discussions of faith at work if we see more Muslims come into different kinds of industries, for example. So this is a group, I name Muslims in particular because they show up in interesting ways in our data so far. This is a group which is quite small in the general population still. It will continue to grow as a result of immigration, but it is still very small, but is more concentrated in certain kinds of occupations. So will those occupations experience different kinds of dynamics related to faith at work and religious discrimination in the workplace? These are all really interesting questions to think about.
Did you have a specific question about age in terms of a particular aspect of the faith-work interface?
I guess it can be taken in a different way because you both interact with students on a regular basis. I guess you can consider them, you don't interview them in an official capacity, but what similarities do you see between the students that you interact with, maybe in a younger cohort, and adults who are in the workplace?
I always think of my students as on the positive leading edge of everything. I don't know. I'm always like, I'm actually not one of these older people who's like, oh my God, generations today. But I think it's when you're a college professor, you always like feel like you're young, you know. And
it's not true.
And that's not true, actually. We age, and then new generations of you just keep coming, right? We were joking. I was like, this was the first year I noticed I could actually be the parent of my students.
I just want you to know that
And Denise is like, no, it's been true longer.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Well, this was the first presentation I've ever done where I couldn't see the font on my paper. So that really says something about my age, too.
We didn't answer the question. I don't know. So to what extent do our students map onto the kind of dynamics in the data that we're noticing?
I would say our students are increasingly diverse, which we're seeing in the data. I would say my students are increasingly not religious, even though I teach at a religious institution. The percentage of our students who identify as having a religious faith tradition is declining, as is true of the general population in that cohort. So I think it's pretty similar. Obviously, you're going to have geographic peculiarities at a particular institution, so it's not going to map exactly, but I think I'm seeing certainly some of the things we're seeing in the data.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to be born out of the data religiously, even over I've been teaching formally at Rice for 10 years, and then, did some teaching at other places before I came here. I feel like I'm noticing what I would think of as an increase in authenticity. That is putting a very normative label on it. So people are not, it seems like my students are not doing things as much for performative reasons. So if they're traditionally religious, it's because they're very much into authenticity and wanting to be fully religious because it's right to be, for them to be traditionally religious. And I am noticing that even non-religious students are increasingly interested in spirituality and spiritual sensibilities, or just thinking of things, higher order matters outside themselves. And so we do have questions on that in the data that we haven't analyzed yet.
So religious engagement is not just a cultural artifact
That's
for
right.
younger people.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. And as a graduate student in the STEM field, you brought up science and how that could be similar to the general public. So I am curious, and continuing that, does the general public correlate well to how scientists act and feel about religion?
Meaning, does what the general public thinks about science actually reflected in the science community itself?
More of like how scientists feel about religion, such as do they believe that there is a God? Do they believe religion is important or prayer is effective? Correlate well to how the public believes those things.
Yeah, that's great. This is not an infomercial for my work, but I have written a couple of books about this, so it's hard to summarize it really quickly, but I'll just give it a stab. So one book that I wrote is about U.S. scientists called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, and then me and a co-author, Christopher Scheidel, wrote a book called Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. So in general, in the U.S., scientists at top universities tend to be of a bit less religious than the general population in the U.S. They also tend to be religiously different. You will find a higher proportion of mainline Protestants and Catholics in science, and a very low proportion of evangelical Christians at the elite schools. You also find a larger proportion of those, what we call the minority religious traditions, so Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims in science, largely as an artifact of the internationalization of science in the U.S. than you do in the general population. So those things. When you go outside of the elite universities, for example, regional state schools, community colleges, and also in research and development, you do find that scientists are quite a bit more religiously similar than the general population. So I can talk for hours about this, but there's just some very broad strokes about those dynamics, which I think has some interesting implications for public dialogue, right, about religion and science issues, the ethics of certain kinds of scientific technologies, especially those that involve what we think of as the beginning of life technologies, fertility technologies, human reproductive genetic technologies, human embryonic stem cell research. And so those kinds of things raise moral questions for many. And so if scientists are very religiously different than the general public, then that can have some implications for public dialogue involving religion.
Really enjoyed the talk from both of you. So what kind of data is there on how people view, feel about religion in the workplace? Is it something that is private, public? Should it be discussed? Does this viewpoint vary across different dimensions like occupation or religious affiliation?
That's a great question.
I think we need to write this question down because we need to answer this, but we don't exactly know. So we have some information so far that we've found in our data that can respond to some of that, but the answer is still pretty fuzzy. So the occupational question in particular, we just don't know. We need to look at that. We have the data, we just haven't analyzed it in that way. As far as the extent to which people are willing to express or feel like it's appropriate to express their faith in the workplace, it varies, and it varies across religious tradition. And so what we saw was that evangelical Christians were most likely to say, yes, it's fine, and I'm doing that, and less so for mainline, less so for Catholic, and less so still for both Muslim and Jewish populations. So it really does depend on who you're talking about as far as whether they're comfortable with that or not. I suspect it also will align with the level in an organization, such that higher level in organizations feel like it's less appropriate to talk about, and more professional jobs will feel like it's less appropriate to talk about, but that's my guess, and we still need to do some work to be able to see if that's the truth based on the data that we have.
There is, in the interviewed data so far, among those who do not define themselves as evangelical Christian, a sort of responsiveness to perceptions of evangelical Christianity, which we find interesting. So Catholics and mainline Protestants that we're interviewing are talking about expression of faith and work and sort of take pains to say that they're not evangelizing. So it's sort of interesting. I'm like, okay, well, I didn't ask. But I mean, so it sort of shows that like their dominant understanding of how one would express faith at work is through perceived evangelization. Does that make sense? So that's been interesting. Another thing that we're asking about is HR, human resource trainings, and the extent to which they ever include religion at all, and whether people ever find them helpful, and how, no.
The answer is generally no.
Right, and how they might be made more helpful. And then we're going to take the show on the road and go to companies and teach them or something, maybe.
I teach HR, among other things, and so some of this is really interesting because I talk about what organizations do with respect to diversity training, and everyone we're talking to says it doesn't work. If anything, it does the opposite.
It sort of polarizes people almost in a weird sort of way. And anyway, we just want to be practical, and we're like, oh, we could be practically helpful by just starting to ask people systematically how HR trainings could be made better. So it's one of the things we're doing.
Hello. So you talked a bit earlier about this language of choice and meaning in work as often being a privilege of people in higher SES groups. So I was wondering, are there any trends in talking about faith in the workplace, meaning and choice among people in lower SES groups, perhaps people working minimum wage jobs or 2 or more part-time jobs?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was striking in our focus groups that we did initially is the utility of religion at work. I don't really know how else to describe it. So what I mean by that is the people who were in high SES jobs that we were talking about in these focus groups were talking about things like making ethical decisions and using their faith to make ethical decisions and to decide which job to take, and feeling like they could decide, like, was I called to this job or called to this other job, using this language of calling. And people in lower SES jobs said things more often like, I'm literally just praying to get through this next 10 minutes.
minute, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's really striking. One of the people we interviewed said, like, when we asked, like, is prayer useful in your work, or how do you think about the integration of prayer with your work? And they said, yeah, I pray all the time, like, just to get through the next few minutes.
Yeah, so lower SES seem to be much more oriented in their approach to thinking about their faith as it was a resource to survive or to deal with really stressful circumstances, whereas people in higher SES, it was a much more cognitive approach and a much more sense of how does this fit my sense of identity, my sense of who I am, my sense of what I'm capable of, much less so about how do I survive.
Well, I've got one last question, and then we'll wrap things up. What's next? How are you planning on disseminating this information? Who's your target audience?
Yeah, so we still have quite a lot of interviews to do with our Christian respondents that we've committed to interviewing. And then we're trying to raise additional money to also interview Jewish and Muslim respondents from our survey.
So if anybody'd like to give us about $40,000, we'd be really excited to have.
We'll take up an offering.
We'll stand in the back after. If you really do want to give that, it's okay. I mean, it's not a total joke. I didn't come planned to ask, but since it came up. So we have committed to writing an academic book from these data, and also to writing a book for pastoral leaders with the Christian data primarily. And we are interested in writing also academic articles with students using the data in a variety of different ways. We have a lot of students very interested in the race and religion overlap, and so we're going to write in that area but also writing other kinds of articles that may be more accessible to a general public audience, to faith leaders, and also to people in the corporate world and medicine and different economic sectors, and creating some resources actually that religious groups can use.
And we're in the process of doing that right now. We've got a number of papers that are out at conferences that will be presented this year, many of whom are with students who are working for the RPLP here at Rice as co-authors and so on. So we're moving in that direction, and we hope to have a number of things out fairly shortly.
Thank you so much. Can we give them a hand?